The Americans, Chapter 24, World War Looms. Section 4, America Moves Toward War. 2 days after Hitler invaded Poland, President Roosevelt spoke reassuringly to Americans about the outbreak of war in Europe. A personal voice, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. "The nation will remain a neutral nation. But I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or his conscience. I have said not once but many times that I have seen war and hate war. As long as it is my power to prevent, there will be no blackout of peace in the U.S." Although Roosevelt knew that Americans were still deeply committed to staying out of war, he also believed that there could be no peace in a world controlled by dictators. Part 1. The United States musters its forces. As German tanks thundered across Poland, Roosevelt revised the Neutrality Act of 1935. At the same time, he began to prepare the nation for the struggle he feared lay just ahead, moving cautiously away from neutrality. In September of 1939, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass a cash-and-carry provision that allowed warring nations to buy U.S. arms as long as they paid cash and transported them in their own ships. Providing the arms, Roosevelt argued, would help France and Britain defeat Hitler and keep the United States out of the war. Isolationists attacked Roosevelt for his actions. However, after 6 weeks of heated debate, Congress passed the Neutrality Act of 1939, and a cash-and-carry policy went into effect. The Axis threat. The United States cash-and-carry policy began to look like too little too late. By summer 1940, France had fallen, and Britain was under siege. Roosevelt scrambled to provide the British with all aid short of war. By June, he had sent Britain 500,000 rifles and 80,000 machine guns, and in early September, the United States traded 50 old destroyers for leases on British military bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later recall this move with affection as a decidedly unneutral act. On September 27th, Americans were jolted by the news that Germany, Italy, and Japan had signed a mutual defense treaty, the Tripartite Pact. The three nations became known as the Axis powers. The Tripartite Pact was aimed at keeping the United States out of the war. Under the treaty, each Axis nation agreed to come to the defense of the others in case of attack. This meant that if the United States were to declare war on any one of the Axis powers, it would face its worst military nightmare, a two-ocean war with fighting in both Atlantic and the Pacific. Building U.S. defenses. Meanwhile, Roosevelt asked Congress to increase spending for national defense. Despite years of U.S. isolationism, Nazi victories in 1940 changed U.S. thinking, and Congress boosted defense spending. Congress also passed the nation's first peacetime military draft, the Selective Training and Service Act. Under this law, 16 million men between the ages of 21 and 35 were registered. Of these, 1 million were to be drafted for 1 year, but were only allowed to serve in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt himself drew the first draft numbers as he told a national radio audience, "This is a most solemn ceremony." Roosevelt runs for a third term. That same year, Roosevelt decided to break the tradition of the two-term presidency, begun by George Washington, and run for re-election. To the great disappointment of isolationists, Roosevelt's Republican opponent, a public utilities executive named Wendell Willkie, supported Roosevelt's policy of aiding Britain. At the same time, both Willkie and Roosevelt promised to keep the nation out of the war. Because there was so little difference between the candidates, the majority of voters chose the one they knew better. Roosevelt was re-elected with nearly 55% of the votes cast. Part 2. The Great Arsenal of Democracy. Not long after the election, President Roosevelt told his radio audience during a fireside chat that it would be impossible to negotiate a peace with Hitler. "No man can tame a tiger into a kitten by stroking it." He warned that if Britain fell, the Axis powers would be left unchallenged to conquer the world, at which point, he said, "all of us in the Americas would be living at the point of a gun." To prevent such a situation, the United States had to help defeat the Axis threat by turning itself into what Roosevelt called the great arsenal of democracy, the Lend-Lease Plan. By late 1940, however, Britain had no more cash to spend in the arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt tried to help by suggesting a new plan that he called a Lend-Lease policy. Under this plan, the president would lend or lease arms and other supplies to any country whose defense was vital to the United States. Roosevelt compared his plan to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. He asserted that this was the only sensible thing to do to prevent the fire from spreading to your own property. Isolationists argued bitterly against the plan, but most Americans favored it, and Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941. Supporting Stalin. Britain was not the only nation to receive Lend-Lease aid. In June of 1941, Hitler broke the agreement he had made in 1939 with Stalin not to go to war and invaded the Soviet Union. Acting on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Roosevelt began sending Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union. Some Americans opposed providing aid to Stalin. Roosevelt, however, agreed with Winston Churchill, who had said, "If Hitler invaded hell, the British would be prepared to work with the devil himself." German wolf packs. Providing Lend-Lease aid was one thing, but to ensure the safe delivery of goods to Britain and to the Soviet Union, supply lines had to be kept open across the Atlantic Ocean. To prevent delivery of Lend-Lease shipments, Hitler deployed hundreds of German submarines, U-boats, to attack supply ships. From the spring through the fall of 1941, individual surface attacks by individual U-boats gave way to what became known as the Wolfpack attack. At night, groups of up to 40 submarines patrolled areas in the North Atlantic where convoys could be expected. Wolfpacks were successful in sinking as much as 350,000 tons of shipments in a single month. In June 1941, President Roosevelt granted the Navy permission for U.S. warships to attack German U-boats in self-defense. By late 1943, the submarine menace was contained by electronic detection techniques, especially radar, and by airborne anti-submarine patrols operating from small escort aircraft carriers. Part 3. FDR Plans for War. Although Roosevelt was popular, his foreign policy was under constant attack. American forces were seriously underarmed. Roosevelt's August 1941 proposal to extend the term of draftees passed in the House of Representatives by only one vote. With the army provided for, Roosevelt began planning for the war that he was certain would come. The Atlantic Charter. While Congress voted on the extension of the draft, Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly at a summit aboard the battleship USS Augusta. Although Churchill hoped for a military commitment, he settled for a joint declaration of war aims called the Atlantic Charter. Both countries pledged the following: collective security, disarmament, self-determination, economic cooperation, and freedom of the seas. Roosevelt disclosed to Churchill that he couldn't ask Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, but he would wage war and do everything to force an incident. The Atlantic Charter became the basis of a new document called a Declaration of the United Nations. The term United Nations was suggested by Roosevelt to express the common purpose of the Allies, those nations that had fought the Axis powers. The declaration was signed by 26 nations, 4/5 of the human race, observed Churchill. Shoot on sight. After a German submarine fired on the U.S. destroyer Greer in the Atlantic on September 4, 1941, Roosevelt ordered Navy commanders to respond. "When you see a rattlesnake poised to strike," the president explained, "you crush him." Roosevelt ordered the Navy to shoot the German submarines on sight. 2 weeks later, the Pink Star, an American merchant ship, was sunk off Greenland. In mid-October, a U-boat torpedoed the U.S. destroyer Kearney, and 11 lives were lost. Days later, German U-boats sank the U.S. destroyer Reuben James, killing more than 100 sailors. "America has been attacked," Roosevelt announced grimly. "The shooting has started, and history has recorded who fired the first shot." As the death toll mounted, the Senate flatly repealed the ban against arming merchant ships. A formal declaration of a full-scale war seemed inevitable. Part 4. Japan attacks the United States. The United States was now involved in an undeclared naval war with Hitler. However, the attack that brought the United States into the war came from Japan. Japan's ambitions in the Pacific. Germany's European victories created new opportunities for Japanese expansionists. Japan was already in control of Manchuria in 1937. Hideki Tojo, chief of staff of Japan's Kwantung Army, launched the invasion into China. As French, Dutch, and British colonies lay unprotected in Asia, Japanese leaders leapt at the opportunity to unite East Asia under Japanese control by seizing the colonial lands. By 1941, the British were too busy fighting Hitler to block Japanese expansion. Only the U.S. and its Pacific Islands remained in Japan's way. The Japanese began their southward push in July 1941 by taking over the French military bases in Indochina, now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The United States protested this new act of aggression by cutting off trade with Japan. The embargoed goods included one Japan could not live without: oil to fuel its war machine. Japanese military leaders warned that without oil, Japan could be defeated without its enemies ever striking a blow. The leaders declared that Japan must either persuade the United States to end its oil embargo or seize the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. This would mean war. Peace talks are questioned. Shortly after becoming the Prime Minister of Japan, Hideki Tojo met with Emperor Hirohito. Tojo promised the emperor that the Japanese government would attempt to preserve peace with the Americans. But on November 5, 1941, Tojo ordered the Japanese Navy to prepare for an attack on the United States. The U.S. military had broken Japan's secret communication codes and learned that Japan was preparing for a strike. What it didn't know was where the attack would come. Late in November, Roosevelt sent out a war warning to military commanders in Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. If war could not be avoided, the warning said, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. And the nation waited. The peace talks went on for a month. Then, on December 6, 1941, Roosevelt received a decoded message that instructed Japan's peace envoy to reject all American peace proposals. "This means war," Roosevelt declared. The attack on Pearl Harbor. Early the next morning, a Japanese dive bomber swooped low over Pearl Harbor, the largest U.S. naval base in the Pacific. The bomber was followed by more than 180 Japanese warplanes launched from 6 aircraft carriers. As the first Japanese bombs found their targets, a radio operator flashed this message: "Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill." For an hour and a half, the Japanese planes were barely disturbed by U.S. anti-aircraft guns and blasted target after target. By the time the last plane soared off around 9:30 a.m., the devastation was appalling. John Garcia, a pipe fitter's apprentice, was there. A personal voice, John Garcia. "It was a mess. I was working in the USS Shaw. I was on a floating dry dock. It was in flames. I started to go down into the pipe fitter's shop to get my toolbox when another wave of Japanese came in. I got under a set of concrete steps at the dry dock where the battleship Pennsylvania was. An officer came by and asked me to go into the Pennsylvania and try to get the fires out. A bomb had penetrated the marine deck and 3 decks below. Under that was the magazines, ammunition, powder, shells, and I said, "There ain't no way I'm going to go down there. It could blow up at any minute. I was young and 16, not stupid." In less than 2 hours, the Japanese had killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,178 more. The surprise raid had sunk or damaged 21 ships, including 8 battleships, nearly the whole U.S. Pacific Fleet. More than 300 aircraft were severely damaged or destroyed. These losses constituted greater damage than the U.S. Navy had suffered in all of World War I. By chance, 3 aircraft carriers at sea escaped the disaster. Their survival would prove crucial to the war's outcome. Reaction to Pearl Harbor. In Washington, the mood ranged from outrage to panic. At the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt watched closely as her husband absorbed the news from Hawaii, each report more terrible than the last. Beneath the president's calm, Eleanor could see how worried he was. "I never wanted to have to fight this war on 2 fronts. Oh, sorry, I thought I was doing Eleanor. "I never wanted to have to fight this war on 2 fronts, Eleanor told his wife. "We haven't the Navy to fight in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, so we will have to build up the Navy and the Air Force, and that will mean that we have to take a good many defeats before we can have a victory." The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy," he said. The Japanese launched an unprovoked and dastardly attack. I'd say dastardly. Congress quickly approved Roosevelt's request for a declaration of war against Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. For all the damage done at Pearl Harbor, perhaps the greatest was to the cause of isolationism. Many who had been former isolationists now supported an all-out American effort. After the surprise attack, isolationist Senator Burton Wheeler proclaimed, "The only thing now to do is lick the hell out of them."